The deep dive. Looks like you guys have really piqued our interest with this one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a ton of stuff on the 2024 election and like all the crazy reactions and fallout.
A lot to unpack there, for sure.
Yeah, so we've got excerpts from that new book everyone's talking about, and then a stack of articles, even some like social media threads.
Interesting.
And we're really gonna try and like get to the bottom of like WHY. Everything got so intense.
I think people are still trying to process it all,
Oh
even there.
no, right? But it seems like you're especially interested in like the left's meltdown.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot in the material that kind of zeroes in on that reaction specifically. And it seems to go way beyond just like your typical, lost the election disappointment.
Right, like this wasn't just like, oh, bummer, we'll get him next time.
Exactly. It's way deeper than that.
So, okay, let's start with like the basics, just to set the stage for everyone listening.
Sounds good.
We got to start with the election result itself. I mean, this wasn't even close. It was a total landslide for Trump.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right?
Right.
Like nobody saw it coming.
Out of nowhere.
Completely.
Mm.
And that unexpectedness, I think, is a big part of why the reaction was so strong. Think about past elections. Even when a party loses big, there's usually some introspection. Some, okay, what went wrong kind of energy.
Some soul searching.
Right. But this time, the book argues it felt different. Like, for the left, it wasn't just a loss. It was an existential threat.
Okay, so existential threat, we're not just talking like disagreeing on policies. We're talking like their whole foundation, their core beliefs were shaken.
Exactly. It's like their entire ideology was being rejected.
Wow. Okay, that definitely helps explain the intensity. But like what events really sent things into a tailspin?
Well, misinformation's a big one, but with a 2024 twist.
Oh, here we go, the good old misinformation talk.
It never goes away.
Sadly not. So what's different this time around?
It's not just that it existed, it's how it spread. Like, the book really gets into how social media algorithms, those things that decide what you see on your feed, played a huge role.
You mean like how if you click on one article about, say, election fraud, then suddenly your whole feed is full of that stuff?
Exactly. It's like the algorithms are designed to keep you engaged, so they show you more of what they think you'll like based on what you've clicked on before.
So it's like personalized panic, basically.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
The problem is it creates these echo chambers where people are only seeing information that reinforces what they already believe, even if it's not accurate.
Okay, so you're already worried about the election, then you see all this stuff online that's like, yeah, be afraid. Be very afraid, even if it's not the whole picture.
Right, and it just feeds into that anxiety and makes it worse.
No wonder things got so heated. And speaking of heated, the book also talks about the debates.
Oh yeah, those were something else. The language used was just so much more inflammatory this time around. Compared to past elections, it was just a whole other level of hostility.
And that probably spilled over into everything that came after.
Right? Absolutely. It set the tone for the entire post-election period.
And then, of course, you had all the legal challenges after the election, which probably brought back some memories of the 2000 election for a lot of people.
For recounts, the court battles, all that uncertainty about who actually won. Yeah, it was very similar in some ways.
Deja vu.
Totally. But this time around, you had that same uncertainty amplified by social media. Like everyone sharing their outrage, their theories, their hot takes in real time.
It's like adding fuel to the fire constantly.
Exactly. Imagine just constantly refreshing your feed and seeing more and more stuff that's validating your fears. It'd be hard not to get swept up in that.
So it's like everything was designed to make people panic and to keep them panicking.
In a way, yeah. And it wasn't just online either.
Yeah.
It started to have real-world impacts, too.
Right, like the book talks about the economic fallout from all this political turmoil, like investors getting spooked, businesses hitting pause. Did they get into specifics on that at all?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It wasn't just a feeling or a vibe. Like, the book mentions how the tech sector, for example, saw a 15% drop in the stock market right after the election results were announced.
Oof, that's gonna hurt.
Yeah, that kind of volatility just makes everyone nervous. Businesses become hesitant to invest, to hire, to do anything, really.
So it's like the whole system just freezes up.
Basically.
Yeah.
And then you have people looking at their 401ks and freaking out.
Right, so the panic wasn't just online or in people's heads, it was hitting their wallets, too. And speaking of panic, it seemed like the Democratic Party itself was falling apart.
Yeah, there was definitely a sense of disarray. The book highlights how there was all this resistance coming from Democratic governors, some even openly challenging the party line.
Like they weren't even trying to put on a united front.
Not really. It just added to the chaos and the feeling that things were spinning out of control.
And then there's Nancy Pelosi's response, or lack thereof, which the book really focuses on. It seemed like she was almost distant from the whole thing.
That's a really interesting point. Some people argued she was being strategic, trying to avoid further inflaming things by staying quiet.
Laying low.
Right. But others felt she should have been more vocal, offering some kind of leadership or guidance at such a critical moment.
Like reassuring the panicked masses.
Exactly. It was a tough call.
Either way, it probably didn't help calm things down. And let's be honest, the media didn't exactly help either. The book definitely calls them out for their role in all this.
Yeah, the 24/7 news cycle thrives on drama and sensationalism. It's hard to resist that.
Think about it. Alarming headlines, constant updates focus on the most divisive aspects of the election. Like, it's all designed to keep you glued to the screen.
And scared.
Right. It creates the sense of regency and fear, even if the actual threat level isn't that high.
It's hard to escape that even if you try. Think about your own social media feeds. They're probably full of news stories and opinions, even if you don't actively seek them out.
It's like this constant drip feed of anxiety.
Exactly. And as we talked about earlier, those algorithms often make it worse by showing you more of what you already agree with, whether it's accurate or not.
So it's like this vicious cycle of panic feeding panic.
Yeah,
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
it can be.
Yeah.
And we haven't even gotten to the specific issues that were driving this wedge between people.
Right. Like, what were the actual things people were fighting about?
Well, the book picks out immigration and energy as two major battlegrounds.
Those are always hot button issues.
They are. And it wasn't just about policy differences either. Like, these issues tapped into deeper fears and anxieties.
So give us an example.
Well, Trump's stance on immigration, for instance, played into a lot of people's concerns about national security and changing demographics, while his energy policies sparked a whole debate about jobs and the economy.
So it's like these policies became symbols for something much bigger, something that people felt really deeply passionate about.
Exactly. No wonder those debates got so heated.
And it feels like we've seen this kind of division before, right?
Yeah,
Especially
exactly.
with elections like 2000 and even going back to 1968 with all the social upheaval.
There are definitely echoes of the past,
Yeah.
but 2024 was unique in how social media amplified and accelerated everything.
Right. In 2000, we didn't have Facebook or Twitter to instantly spread every rumor and conspiracy theory.
And in 1968, the media landscape was completely different. Information moved at a much slower pace.
So it's like 2024 was the perfect storm, a divisive election, a media environment primed for panic, and social media algorithms just turning up the volume on everything.
It was a recipe for disaster.
But even with all that, it's still hard to grasp how people ended up seeing the same event in such drastically different ways.
That's where this concept of dueling narratives comes in. The book describes how the left felt the right was being brainwashed by propaganda and misinformation, while the right believed the left was finally being red-pilled or awakened to the truth.
Okay, red-pilled. I
Right.
feel like we need to explain that one for anyone who's not familiar with that term. It's often used in online communities to describe a moment of sudden enlightenment, like seeing the world in a whole new way.
Exactly. And the problem is both sides felt like the other was being manipulated, which just added to the sense of fear and urgency.
It's like everyone was convinced they were fighting against some evil force trying to control them.
That's a great way to put it. It created this us versus them mentality that made any kind of compromise or understanding almost impossible.
So it's almost like two different realities were clashing with no way to bridge the gap. And speaking of clashing, we can't talk about this election without talking about the man at the center of it all,
Yeah.
Donald Trump. The book goes into some detail about his background and how it shaped his approach to politics.
Yeah, his background as a businessman definitely influenced his style. He was a master of branding, of creating a larger-than-life persona.
Like a walking billboard.
Exactly. And he brought that same approach to politics, especially with his unconventional use of social media, specifically Twitter.
He was constantly tweeting, often bypassing traditional media outlets, and speaking directly to his supporters.
Right, and that direct connection, combined with his outsider status, really resonated with people who felt ignored by the political establishment.
So it was like he was hacking the system.
In a way, yeah. And understanding that appeal is crucial to understanding the panic that followed.
Sure.
It's not just about disagreeing with his policies, it's about a fundamental shift in how people view politics and leadership.
So we've talked about the shocking election results, the events that fueled the flames, the role of media and social media, and even a bit about Trump's background. But what about the actual tangible consequences of all this panic? Like, what happened in the economy?
That's where we move from the theoretical to the very real impact on people's lives.
Yeah.
Investors freaking out is one thing, but what did that actually look like for everyday people?
Right. Give us the nitty-gritty.
Okay, so imagine you're an investor at this time. You see the stock market swinging wildly, businesses putting major decisions on hold. That kind of uncertainty is incredibly unsettling, right?
Definitely makes you want to just bury your money in the backyard.
Right. You might put off that big purchase, reconsider that vacation just because you're not sure what's coming next.
Makes sense. And that decrease in consumer confidence just creates this ripple effect throughout the entire economy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The book gives the example of how retail sales, particularly in durable goods like cars and appliances, dropped significantly in the weeks following the election. People were holding onto their money, waiting to see what would happen next.
So the panic wasn't just a political phenomenon, it was impacting people's everyday lives, their financial decisions, their sense of security.
It became very real very quickly.
It's scary how quickly that fear can spread and take root.
It is. But amidst all this turmoil, something interesting happened. The book highlights how communities began to respond with incredible solidarity and support, almost like a counterforce to the panic.
Okay, that's kind of heartwarming to hear. It wasn't all doom and gloom.
Definitely not. People found ways to cope to help each other, to create a sense of hope amidst all the chaos.
So it's like even in the darkest of times, humanity shines through.
Exactly. And that's what we'll delve into next. It wasn't just like random acts of kindness either. It was more organized than that. The book describes this surge in community response. It's like everyone kind of took a deep breath and was like, okay, what can we do?
Okay, so like what did that actually look like? Give us some examples.
Well, for one, there was a ton of activity on like online forums and support groups. People were sharing their anxieties, finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone, and even coordinating real-world meetups to offer support and resources.
Makes sense. When the world feels chaotic, you crave connection. You want to know that other people get it.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that this wasn't limited to any one political group. The book gives examples of people with completely different political beliefs coming together to help their neighbors donate to food banks, organize community events.
Wow, so it's like the shared experience of the panic kind of transcended their political differences.
It's like that saying, there's no atheist in a foxhole.
Yeah.
Maybe there's no Democrat or Republican when everyone's facing a crisis together.
Right. It puts things in perspective. But the book also talks about the mental health impacts of all this, right? It wasn't just about economic worries. People were genuinely suffering.
Absolutely. The book highlights how the constant barrage of news, the echo chambers on social media, the overall fear-mongering, it all took a toll on mental health. They cite studies showing a spike in anxiety, depression, even PTSD symptoms in the months following the election.
It's like the panic itself became this collective trauma that everyone was going through.
It really did. And for people already dealing with mental health challenges, it must have been incredibly tough to navigate.
I can't even imagine. It's so important to remember that it's okay to not be okay and to reach out for help if you need it.
Absolutely. The book really emphasizes the importance of seeking help and support during times like these. Whether it's through therapy support groups or even just talking to trusted friends and family, it's not a sign of weakness to reach out. It's actually a sign of strength.
Couldn't agree more. And thankfully, there are so many resources available now, like hotlines, therapy apps, online support groups. It's important to remember you're not alone, and there are people who understand what you're going through.
For sure. And that's where leadership comes in. The book argues that effective leaders played a critical role in either calming the panic or, unfortunately, fanning the flames.
So, like, what separated the good leaders from the bad ones in this situation? Was it just about having the right policies?
Not necessarily. The book found that the most effective leaders were those who acknowledged the fear and uncertainty, but also offered reassurance and a clear path forward.
So it's about validating people's feelings, but also giving them something to hold on to.
Exactly. They didn't shy away from the difficult conversations, but they also provided a sense of hope and direction.
So it was a balance of empathy and action. Like, I hear you, this is scary, but here's what we're going to do about it.
Exactly. Transparency and clear communication were crucial. But it was a tough balancing act, especially given how polarized everything was. Leaders had to navigate a minefield trying to address everyone's concerns without alienating any particular group.
It's like walking a tightrope.
It really was.
Yeah.
And all this was happening against the backdrop of all the economic turmoil. We've talked about the market volatility and declining consumer confidence, but did the sources get into specifics about how that actually played out?
Yeah, like how did that economic anxiety actually manifest?
The book digs into how economic anxiety became both a cause and a consequence of the panic. Like when people are worried about their jobs, their savings, their future, they're more likely to make impulsive decisions. And that can just make the panic worse.
It's a vicious cycle. The fear feeds the economic instability, and the economic instability feeds the fear.
Exactly. And this is where the book raises some really important questions about how we, as a society, can become more resilient to this kind of mass panic.
Yeah.
Like, what can we do individually and collectively to navigate these turbulent times without completely losing our minds?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because it's one thing to understand why the panic happened, but it's another thing entirely to figure out how to prevent it from happening again.
Absolutely. And the book actually offers some insights into that both on a personal level and a societal level.
Okay, so let's break it down. Starting with the personal level, what can individuals do to kind of protect themselves from getting swept up in this kind of mass hysteria?
Well, the first step, as we've kind of touched on, is to be aware of how our own minds work. Like, understand that we're all susceptible to emotional contagion, especially in the age of social media, where fear and outrage can spread like wildfire.
So basically, be mindful of the information you're consuming, the sources you're trusting, the people you're surrounding yourself with.
Exactly. It's also crucial to develop healthy coping mechanisms for managing anxiety and stress.
Mm.
The book talks about the benefits of mindfulness practices, exercise, spending time in nature, anything that helps you ground yourself and stay centered when the world feels like it's spinning out of control.
It's like building a personal panic toolkit.
Right.
What are some other tools we might need in there?
Another important one is having strong social support networks. Having people you can talk to, confide, and lean on during tough times can make a huge difference.
So basically, don't underestimate the power of human connection, especially when things feel bleak.
Exactly. But individual resilience can only take us so far. The book also delves into the systemic issues that contribute to this kind of mass panic, things like political polarization, economic inequality, and the erosion of trust in institutions.
Okay, so those are some pretty big, complex issues. Where do we even begin to address those?
That's where things get tricky because there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to require a multi-pronged approach involving both individual efforts and systemic changes.
Okay, so let's start with the individual efforts. What can people do in their own lives to kind of contribute to a more resilient society?
One of the most powerful things we can do is to engage in civil discourse with people who hold different views. It's so easy to retreat into our echo chambers, but that just reinforces the polarization. We need to be willing to have difficult conversations, to listen to each other, and to try to understand where the other person is coming from.
I mean, that sounds challenging, especially in today's climate where it feels like everyone's just shouting at each other. But I guess growth often happens outside of our comfort zones, right?
It does. And it's essential if we want to build a more tolerant and understanding society.
So civil discourse, stepping outside our echo chambers and being open to different perspectives, what else can we do on an individual level?
Another important step is to support organizations and initiatives that are working to address the root causes of the panic, whether it's donating to charities that combat poverty, volunteering for organizations that promote civic engagement, or simply spreading awareness about these issues. Every little bit helps.
So basically put our money where our mouth is and take action to support the causes we believe in.
Exactly. But individual efforts, while important, are only part of the solution. We also need systemic changes to address the underlying problems that are fueling this panic.
And that's where things get really complicated, right? Because those are big systemic issues that are so deeply ingrained in our society.
Right.
It's not like we can just flip a switch and suddenly everything's fixed.
You're absolutely right. It's a long game, and it's going to require sustained effort and collaboration from all sectors of society. But the book offers some hope by highlighting examples of communities and organizations that are successfully tackling these challenges.
Okay, so give us some examples. What are some of the things that are working?
Well, one promising approach is focusing on building social capital. This involves creating spaces and opportunities for people from different backgrounds to connect, build relationships, and develop a sense of shared identity.
So it's like creating a web of interconnectedness that can help to counter the forces of division and polarization.
Exactly. And this can be done through a variety of initiatives like community gardens, interfaith dialogues, arts and cultural programs, and even just creating more public spaces where people can interact and mingle.
It's like weaving a stronger social fabric one thread at a time.
Yes, and the book argues that this kind of grassroots effort, when combined with top-down policy changes that address economic inequality and promote social justice, can create a more resilient and equitable society that is less susceptible to mass panic.
So it's a combination of bottom-up and top-down approaches of individual empowerment and systemic change. But even with all that, it's still hard to imagine a future where we're completely immune to this kind of collective frenzy.
You're right, there will always be challenges and there will always be events that trigger fear and anxiety. But the goal isn't necessarily to eliminate panic altogether. It's about learning how to manage it, how to channel it into constructive action, and how to prevent it from spiraling out of control.
So it's about building a society that's not just strong, but also flexible, adaptable, and able to bounce back from adversity?
Exactly. And that's where the lessons we've learned from the 2024 election panic can be incredibly valuable. By understanding the factors that contributed to the panic, the coping mechanisms that emerged, and the potential solutions that are being explored, we can equip ourselves with the knowledge and tools to navigate future challenges with more grace and resilience.
That's a powerful message. But it's also important to acknowledge that this is an ongoing process. We're not going to solve these problems overnight.
You're absolutely right. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Even small steps in the right direction can make a big difference over time.
Well, so it's about perseverance, about staying committed to the long game, even when things feel daunting.
Exactly. And it's about believing that a better future is possible even when things seem bleak.
I like that. A belief in the possibility of a better future. That's something we can all hold on to.
It is. And it's something worth fighting for.
Okay, so we've covered like a ton of ground here. All the events leading up to the panic, the things that made it worse, and even some ideas for like how to avoid this kind of meltdown in the future.
Yeah, it's been a lot.
It has. But I think we should circle back to like your original question. Why was the reaction to this election so intense, so different from anything we've seen before?
It's the question everyone's asking, right?
Mhm.
And I think we've touched on some of the reasons like that unexpected landslide victory for Trump. I mean,
Oh,
just imagine being on the other side of that, expecting a close race, maybe even a win for your candidate, and then bam.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's incredibly disorienting, especially when you consider how polarized things already were.
Like the rug was pulled out from under them and suddenly they're in free fall.
Exactly. And then you add in everything else. The deep divisions, the media and social media frenzy, the economic anxieties that were already bubbling under the surface.
It really was the perfect storm.
It was. And we can't ignore the elephant in the room. Trump himself was a huge factor in all of this.
Oh, definitely. His personality, his rhetoric, that whole Twitter thing.
Exactly. It all added to the chaos and uncertainty.
Like he was this lightning rod for both like intense love and intense hate.
It's true. And his whole presence just seemed to magnify everything, the good and the bad.
He definitely knew how to push buttons.
He did. And he was really good at tapping into people's anxieties,
Right.
whether it was about the economy or cultural change or just this feeling that traditional values were slipping away.
Like he was the only one who could fix it all.
Right, and that really resonated with a lot of people. But for those who didn't buy into that, it was terrifying.
To see someone who seemed to embody all their fears rising to power.
Exactly. And I think that gets to the core of why this election was so different.
Mhm.
It wasn't just about politics. It was about a clash of worldviews, like a feeling that the very fabric of America was being ripped apart.
Two completely different realities with no overlap.
Exactly. And that kind of division is terrifying, especially when it's playing out on such a huge stage.
It's like a collective identity crisis. Like, who are we as a nation?
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's what made this election so unique, so unsettling, and ultimately so panic-inducing.
But even with all the chaos and fear, we also saw amazing examples of resilience, right? People coming together, supporting each other, trying to bridge the divides. Does that give us any hope for moving forward, for healing as a nation?
I think it's crucial to remember that because it reminds us that even in the darkest times, there's still good in the world. Those acts of kindness, those moments of unity, those efforts to connect with people who are different from us, those are the building blocks of a more resilient and compassionate society.
It's like those small acts become seeds of hope.
Exactly. And that's what I want our listeners to take away from this.
Mhm.
Yes, the 2024 election panic was a traumatic experience for many, but it also showed us how strong we can be, both individually and as a community.
We're tougher than we think.
We are. And by learning from our mistakes and working to create a more just and equitable world, we can make sure that panic and division don't win.
Powerful stuff. Well, that about wraps it up for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a wild ride.
It really has. But as we've seen, even amidst the chaos, there's hope for a better tomorrow.
There is. And that hope starts with each of us.
So to all our listeners out there, we leave you with this. Given what we've learned, is there a way to be politically engaged without getting swept up in the panic? Something to think about as we all move forward together. Thanks for listening.